Let's move on and talk about the last statement we need to talk about now, and that's my retained earnings statement. A retained earnings statement shows me the changes in a business's retained earnings during a period of time. There are just a couple of things that can affect our retained earnings. Earning a net income makes the net worth of my business go up. Incurring a net loss makes the net worth of my business go down. Paying dividends will make my retained earnings go down because I did not retain those earnings. I paid them out as a dividend. So the items which will affect my net worth during the period are my net income or net loss, and then my dividends. The heading for the retained earnings statement: company name, name of the statement. The last line is exactly like it is on the income statement. Again, it covers a period of time for a month or a quarter, just like the income statement did. Now, remember I gave you acronyms for like the income statement and for the balance sheet, and I said you probably don't need those. I'm going to give you an acronym for the retained earnings statement, and I think you probably do want it. Matter of fact, it's a bad one. It's so bad I didn't even put it on your handout. But if I were you, I would write down what I'm going to tell you is your acronym. Big noses drip in excess. If I were you, I would write that down. I don't think you need it for the income statement or the balance sheet. I think you might well need it for the statement of retained earnings. Big noses drip in excess. BNDIE. B stands for my beginning retained earnings. And if you know that the first line is B and it's the beginning, I bet you can guess what the E is going to stand for. The ending retained earnings. We're going to start with the beginning retained earnings. We're going to add in my net income, but if it is a net loss, I would subtract it. D says I'm going to subtract my dividends. Now, the next part of this is kind of the tricky part. I put I. Hopefully, I'm going to have an increase in retained earnings. However, depending on my figure, sometimes I have a decrease, and I'll show you an example of that. If we take the beginning retained earnings, we add the increase or subtract the decrease, that will then give me my ending retained earnings. So we're explaining why my retained earnings changes from the beginning of the period to the end of the period. Let's look at an example with some numbers here and make a little bit more sense. All right, notice the heading. It covers a period of time. This is for the year that ends on December 31st. Now, on the first line, I don't actually write the word beginning. Notice what I wrote instead. Retained earnings, comma, January 1st. Why is that? Well, if this is for the year that ends on December 31st, that year would begin on January 1st. That says these are my retained earnings on the first day of the year. The next one says we add in the net income. That comes to us from the income statement. We have to do the income statement before we do this one. Less the dividends. Subtract the dividends. The difference between my net income and my dividends, these two figures, is going to hopefully be an increase in retained earnings. It's an increase if the net income is bigger than the dividends. If the dividends are bigger than the net income, it won't be an increase, it will be a decrease. If it's a net loss, it's automatically going to be a decrease. Exactly. Okay? So here, 3,000 net income minus 600 dividends. We have more net income than dividends, so I have a $2,400 increase in my retained earnings. Retained earnings were 5,000. They went up by 2,400, so my retained earnings at the end of the period now are 7,400. Notice, what do I write? Not just the E down here. Okay, what did I write? Retained earnings, December 31st. What's the only difference between the words on the first line and the words on the last line? The dates. The first one is what we started with on January 1st. The last one's what we ended with on December 31st. Let's just change one number. I changed the dividends. I made it 6,600. 6,600. Net income is 3,000, 6,600 in dividends. This time, do I have an increase or a decrease in my retained earnings? A decrease. Okay, I put parentheses around this number to show it as a decrease. So now it's a negative number, so we end up with only $1,400 in retained earnings. All right, let's do a retained earnings statement. What page are we on? 20. Okay. Beginning retained earnings is $2,000. My dividends are $350, and my net income is a question mark. Where could we find the amount of my net income? The income statement, back to page 12. Let's go back to page 12. I want you to look at the income statement and tell me what the amount of my net income was. $850. Do we agree? Everybody see where that came from? We have to do the income statement before we can do the retained earnings statement because we need to know the amount of net income. Does everybody see where we got that number? All right. So now let's prepare a retained earnings statement. First line is company name. You're welcome to abbreviate that. Second line is the name of the statement. This is my retained earnings statement. Third line is the date line, and it is identical to the date line on the income statement. It is for the month ended April 30th, just like the income statement was for the month ended April 30th. Big noses drip in excess. What does the B stand for? Beginning retained earnings. All right, we're not going to actually write beginning retained earnings. We're going to write what? Retained earnings, comma, and then what? April 1st, because this is for the month that ends on April 30th. So the beginning date for that month would have been April 1st. So, retained earnings, April 1st, $2,000. Put that in the far right column for the number, please. B, big noses. What comes next? What's N? Net income or net loss. In our case, it's net income of $850. That number comes from the income statement. Have to do the income statement first so we know the amount to drop into this statement. Put that in the left column, yes. Big noses drip. What does D stand for? Dividends, okay. Big noses drip in, hopefully we have an increase in retained earnings. Well, let's look and see. We have to compare what? The amount of my net income to the amount of my dividends. My net income was $850, my dividends were $350. Did I have an increase or a decrease in my retained earnings? I had an increase. Why? Because the $850 in net income was bigger than my $350 in dividends. So I would have an increase in retained earnings. We're going to take the difference, that $500, we're going to put it in the right column. Okay. So my retained earnings to start the month were $2,000. They increased by $500. 2,000 plus 500 says that at the end of the month, how much did I have in retained earnings? 2,500. We're not going to actually write ending retained earnings though. We're going to write retained earnings, comma, and then what? April 30th, the ending date. The ending date. So notice the words on the first line and the words on the last line are almost the same. The only difference being the date. April 1st on the first line, April 30th on the last line. Let me just mention that column issue again. Nothing big to get too worked up over. But do you see now why I had to put these two numbers, the 850 and the 350, over in that column to the left? Because I needed to have this 500 directly beneath that 2,000 so I could add them together. Okay? So when you're adding numbers together, they have to be one beneath the other, nothing in the middle. Same thing if you're subtracting. So I'm adding these together. They had to be, I had to arrange it so that they were one beneath the other with nothing in the middle. If I had stuck these over here, it would have been very confusing then. And the issue about the dollar signs again. First number in a calculation gets a dollar sign. So we're adding these two, so that one gets a dollar sign, this one doesn't. First number in each calculation, that one gets a dollar sign, this one doesn't. This one gets a dollar sign just because it's the final answer. The final answer always gets a dollar sign and a double underline. I don't want you to sweat those little points too much right now. But anyway, just because I mentioned them because some students start asking me, so I just want you to know. Now, when did we do the balance sheet? Was that on page 16, if I recall?
Yeah.
Flip back to page 16 for just a minute. And do you see on page 16 that I told you that the amount of retained earnings was $2,500? Realistically, here's what we have to do. We prepare an income statement, and on that income statement, we calculate net income. We then can do the retained earnings statement. On the retained earnings statement, we calculate ending retained earnings. We can then take that ending retained earnings number and put it on the balance sheet. I intentionally taught these statements to you in a different order because I find that students need to understand the balance sheet before I try to explain to them the retained earnings statement. Okay, they just get really confused if I do it in the opposite order. So I purposely taught you the balance sheet first, in which case I had to tell you what retained earnings was. The real way we figure that number, though, is from the statement of retained earnings. Whatever we calculate as ending retained earnings, we're then going to take and drop into our balance sheet. All right, in what order do we prepare the statements? I think I've said this a couple of times. Income statement first, why? So we can calculate net income, and it can go on the statement of retained earnings. Do statement of retained earnings second, why? So we calculate ending retained earnings, so it can then go on the balance sheet. If you tried to do the statements in any other order, you would find yourself missing something. You would not be able to complete. And I think we've said these at length. Adding two numbers together or subtracting them, they go one beneath the other with nothing in the middle. Final total gets a dollar sign and a double underline. dollar signs, first number in a calculation gets a dollar sign. And if you have only one of an item, you can omit showing a total.